I typically do record these webinars because we do put them on the C YouTube page for members that would like to view them in the future. So I have pressed record. It's a small audience, so in a minute we'll go around the room, but you can pause if you'd like and ask questions along. I don't think Whitney would mind.
No, I'd much rather be interactive.
Okay, great. So we're delighted to have Whitney with us. She's a professor in the Department of Religion at UF, where my boy is, and he refuses to come home. I haven't seen him since Christmas. He loves it so much there. And she specializes in religion and nature. She's the author of Living Sustainably: What Intentional Communities Can Teach Us About Democracy, Simplicity, and Nonviolence. But most importantly, and what I think she wants you to know about her, is that she's an avid kayaker, sailor, and paddleboarder, and very passionate about the environment. So we're lucky to have her here tonight to present her presentation for her year with plastics. Real quick, Whitney, if you don't mind, I just want to go around, and because we have a few new people who haven't been with us in the past. Beth Courtwright is a volunteer with Paddle Florida, and I believe an assessor with Florida Sea. Is that correct, Beth?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
And I work for that.
So she's been trained, and I've yet to feed her anything to assess, but we hope to take care of that soon. So if you're heading back to Naples, I might have something for you to assess very soon. And Liz is with us. Liz, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey.
Hi, Liz.
Good to hear your voice, Nancy and Whitney. And I see Wayne Dushkoff's on there. Hey, Wayne.
Hey, Liz.
Hear your voice too. Yeah, we're up here in the mountains. You don't even want to know how nice it is. We'll just.
So Liz is a former board member with C, and we're lucky to have her joining us in October for a webinar. So watch for that one coming up. We have Bruce. How's Bruce tonight?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's taken a few sessions off, but it's good to be back. I'm really excited to hear what Whitney has to say as a Florida Sea assessor and as a social scientist myself. I'll be interested to hear what she has to say.
Well, and so what region of the state are you, Bruce?
I'm in Polk County.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, and we have Lynn. I think Lynn has joined us about every month, haven't you, Lynn?
I try. Depends on where I am. Right now I'm in Denver, and normally I'm in St. Pete, which is my home area, and college instructor, and I have done the training for assessing for C, so lots of different things.
Great. And finally, Wayne. How are you tonight, Wayne?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. And you want to just remind everyone your role, and you're a member of C, and I believe, are you an assessor?
Yeah, I've been an assessor 2 different times.
Wonderful.
But not actually have done any assessments yet. So
right.
I'm anxious to do that.
Good. Wonderful. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just turn the keys over to you, Whitney. I'll advance when you're ready, and then if there is background noise, that might mean that some of us need to mute, but certainly chime in and unmute if you want to ask Whitney a question. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you want to say anything else to the audience, and go ahead and let me know when you want to advance slides.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for tuning in for this, and please feel free to ask questions. I'd much rather do something interactive than just lecture at people. As a teacher, I know everyone hates to be lectured at. And so what I'm going to talk to you all about, as the title says, is my year of plastics. And in 2016, I had a number of experiences going from the Keys to Alaska, the Caribbean, that really opened my eyes to some of the ways in which the issue of plastics is affecting us. And since some of y'all are either assessors or something like tour guides, these are either things to think about or maybe some talking points if you are out with guests, or you can say, Beth, if you're something you're doing on Paddle Florida. So anyway, just to quickly explain this picture on the front, that was taken on New Year's Eve, and that is the motor of our sailboat as we were motoring along right on the edge of Bay Honda, right near where those rocks are, and suddenly our motor gets caught in this huge piece of plastic. So I'm hanging off the ladder on the end of the boat, trying to cut that thing off before our boat went crashing into the shores. And then I was able to get it off in time, get back on the boat, and we sailed over and went over to the Mosquito Keys where we're headed. But it was sort of a fitting end to me on New Year's Eve of a year I'd spent almost entirely on plastics that, once again, we're getting tripped up on this. Would you advance to the next slide, please?
Sure.
So the first thing I did that really started opening my eyes on plastics, last February 2016, I took part in something called Expedition, which you can see with 2 X's. And basically it's a series of all female voyages sailing on a 72-foot sailboat in different parts of the world. Right now they're going around Britain. The one I took part in was sailing from Trinidad, stopping in Barbados, and ending up in St. Lucia. And basically it's a couple different things. On the one hand, it's a voyage to make people aware of what's happening with plastics in the environment, from macroplastics to what happens when the plastics start to degrade and what happens to our bodies. And also it's a form of citizen science as well, and that all of us who are on there as crew were doing some publicity things. Like for me, I wrote, but we're also helping with some of the scientific experiments that were taking place as well. Next slide, please. So one of the first things we did, we left from St. Lucia, and then, sorry, we left from Trinidad and went to Barbados. We went on a tour, and we went to their plastics dump, and you can barely see it from that slide, but it's pretty much apocalyptic. All that junk in that ditch back there, all of that is plastics, water bottles, and just plastic bags, anything you can imagine. And they're really trying in Barbados to clean things up, but not only do they have a plastic problem, being a small island, they end up catching a bunch of stuff too, and it really makes you aware of, when you see all those plastic water bottles and this and that, it really makes us aware of our consumption levels. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. And scientists, for the most part, have been talking about these 5 gyres of plastics, in which all these large plastics, you can see one picture of that plastic soup ocean, but these plastics are spinning around, caught in various currents, whether it's in the North Pacific or North Atlantic, and they're just spinning around. They become so solid in some case, they're almost like islands. And that had been fairly assumed, that these plastics just sat out there, and that in itself is bad enough, because you can imagine what happens with animals and other kind of marine life. But one of the questions people started asking is, what happens to all these plastics? What if they start to degrade? Next slide, please. And so Expedition, along with different scientists around the world, are trying to start asking questions about what, with all that material in the plastics, what if they become part of our bodies, whether that's through drinking water, through part of the food chain, animals start eating them, they become microplastics, and a number of these things can have really serious effects on the human body. So a number of the projects that are affiliated and going on in the US and other parts of the world, you can see the Marine Litter Watch. One of the neat things, this is an app, the Marine Debris Tracker, that was designed by University of Georgia. You can actually get this app on your phone, and if you're going out on say a beach cleanup or pulling garbage in on Pottle, Florida or something, you can actually mark a lot of the different plastics that you see, and it helps you see what's there. It also gets tracked into a larger system, and it helps the scientist as well. And some of the most interesting research, I think, is done particularly up in Sweden, and up in the UK, is the toxic analysis of the water sample, and really how toxic are these things. If we're eating fish that are living in these waters, what is happening to the human body? Next slide, please. So one of the things we did, and this part was kind of physical and fun, as part of the citizen science, we threw out this manta trawler, which was actually a huge effort to do. You could see that big pole there. We had to get that, it took about 8 of us there's 14 of us on the boat. It took about 8 of us just to get that pole out perpendicular to the boat. Then we hooked up the trawler to the boat and to that pole, and then threw it in. And that would drag for 2 different sessions of 30 minutes. And then after that, we would pull it in and start looking. The next slide, please. Some people would be filtering it, looking, and then those particles would be tabulated and put in a lab downstairs in the bottom of the boat. And most of these materials would be sent off after the trip and going to various labs in different parts. A lot of it was going to University of Georgia. There's some very active people there. Next slide. And so it was an interesting thing, you know, as I was learning a whole lot about plastics and even the concept of what happens when they biodegrade. It was also a pretty dynamic a place to be working on this, as we're trying to filter the water and look at these various things, you know, the boats listing and, you know, healing over. And I'm a pretty new sailor, so all this was new to me. I actually learned quite a bit on the boat, but it certainly gave me a interesting, my kind of research is usually ethnography. I do field work. I don't go out into situations like that. So it was very interesting for me learning about some of the conditions under which science is done. Next slide. One of the scientists downstairs, Janica, she's from Copenhagen. She was looking at some of the materials that you could see under a microscope, and so this was something she was able to integrate into her research. But it was interesting. We had an entire lab on the boat, and a lot of pretty serious scientists. As a humanist, I was there, but it was interesting to work with some of the scientists on this. Next slide, please. So the research, they haven't finished all of the tabulation and the research, but much of it is, they're starting to get some publications out. Most of the people working on this in Sweden, UK, and Georgia. And again, one of the interesting things is, you know, when all these different types of plastics, whether it's packaging or firefighting foams, which I think is fairly toxic, or personal care products, you know, what happens when that gets into the human body, and particularly a lot of these are endocrine disruptors, which has a lot of effect on hormones and, you know, women's health and human health in general. So they're just starting to get some of these publications out and get it tabulated, but it's definitely something to be paying attention to, and I'm waiting for the results in some of this. Next slide, please. One of the most, by the way, before we go into this, anyone have any questions or comments? Nope. Okay. One of the most interesting things for me was working with local people on this, and the statement at the bottom, "There's no magical place called away," that was by that woman in the green shirt sitting there. And this is a group of environmentalist and tourism council people in Barbados. And so we met with them, talked about what we're doing and what their needs were, and we did a cleanup with them. And we did this in several different places, did beach cleanups, and just really met and talked about what their needs were and what their concerns were with plastics. And I think for me, that was one of the most interesting parts, to see what they thought they needed and what what their local concerns were, because they're generating a certain amount of trash, but they're also receiving a lot from cruise ships and tourism and just all the material that floats down to there. So I think that was one of the richest parts of the whole trip for me. Next slide, please. And so there's a certain amount of work on this trip. It was, in some ways it was really physically challenging. In other ways, it was just a lot of fun. So we had a little bit of sailing. We had a little bit of fun. Next slide, please. A little bit of swimming time as well. That's just off of Barbados. But again, I think one of the most interesting things to me was really speaking. In each of the places we went, we met with locals. We gave a talk at the University of West Indies, which as a professor was really interesting to talk to the students there who are interested in sustainability issues. We also talked with some high school students as well, and I really enjoyed that. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to move, I talked a little about microplastics. Now we're going to move to a much colder climate and talk about some of the big plastics. So what I did, sounds like my summer vacation talk. What I did last summer, I went up to Alaska, my husband and I and a group of us, and joined a team that was basically picking up plastics by sea kayak on Shuyak Island. And so this cabin here is that was our base camp. That is actually a state park hut on Shuyak Island. We all lived in little tents in there. Next slide, please. And so Shuyak Island, it's a state park, and the person who organized this lives in Kodiak, Alaska. His name is Tom Pogson. He's a kayak instructor. He also runs an NGO called the Island Trails Network. And the year before, he'd taken people up to another small island, and basically people did it by foot or by ATV. But what you realize is with the miles and miles and miles of coastline along Alaska, that you could actually get to a lot of things by sea kayak. It could be just with the currents, that they have really high tides, and it's very choppy water for the most part, so it could be really difficult to get a motorboat up to the shore. So he thought he could get teams of people to go pick up these materials by sea kayak. So he basically got a large grant, and from mid-June to the end of August last summer, he had groups of about 6 to 8 people at a time come up, stay for 2 weeks, and basically paddle around and pick up all this garbage. And just those 10 weeks, our group picked up about over 10 tons. That was like 7 of us picking up 10 tons of garbage. And that, again, was a real eye-opener for what's there. So next slide, please. One of the fun benefits was flying over all this and getting my first trip on a float plane. So we're fortunate going out in that the weather was very calm. It was a very nice, calm ride. You could see how calm the water is. On the way back, it wasn't quite the same, but we did get out eventually. Next slide. So on our first day there, we saw a mother and a couple of grizzlies. We didn't see any bears after that, but that was a common theme since we were off and off either by ourselves or in groups of 2s. We're all walking around yelling bear, 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 just to scare them away. But it was a real treat to see the bears that first day and then not really have to think about it too much after that. But it's definitely sobering when you're walking around picking up garbage and having to think about bears there as well. So next slide, please. So this here, that's a picture of Tom Pogson, and that is one of the smaller bays the bays we picked up things from. And just from the picture, you could see it's a whole range of things. That was just a couple hours of work, but there's a buoy there. He's holding that long pole. We found a number of laundry crates, and a lot of those laundry crates are things that come over from Japan. Tom was able to recognize some of the styles of the various things that we saw, and he recognized, for example, that laundry crate is a particular style that comes from Japan. And there is a lot of stuff that flows over there. Some of the things, some of the garbage was from the tsunami. Some of the lighter stuff had already come over, but the kind of things that float in that second level, they're still coming over. So that part in the back area didn't get quite as much stuff. I'll show you some pictures of some of the things we found in the front area as well. But just with those coastlines, they're exposed to the Pacific. All those things from the Pacific, they just get all of that. So they really, you think of Alaska as pristine, and from far away it looks like it, but there's a lot of junk in there. Next slide, please. So we paddled to the different islands and different places by sea kayak. That's a particularly placid day. We pretty much had to time our pickups by where the wind was blowing from, because some of the landings on these rocky shores, we didn't want to do anything with more than, say, 3 foot surf landings. That could be dangerous. And we're so far out, if anything happened, they said the Coast Guard may or may not come and get us because they have a limited budget. So we generally took it all pretty calmly in that. And you're probably wondering, how are they going to get all this crap back in the sea kayaks? Well, the answer is we didn't. What we did was you could see on the back of that kayak, we had these big Tyvek bags, and we put all the stuff in bags, aggregate it in different places, and then Tom had hired some motorboats to come out and pick all that stuff up in the fall, like after the different groups had gone through. So we basically picked up all the stuff, but we didn't have to carry it back in the kayaks. Next slide, please. So this picture here is just a very typical scene. You'd be walking along, and there's, because of the currents and the tides, there's all these, so many logs, and you just look down, and at first you don't think you see anything, and then you suddenly see a plastic water bottle, and the nets were some of the, lots of fishing nets. And people who are from Alaska said sometimes the fishermen sort of toss them over, other times they just fall off by accident, or it could be, you know, a marine accident. But that was some of the hardest stuff, to pull those nets out, because it often meant sitting there. We had little knives. We cut those things apart. Sometimes we had to move the piles of wood apart, and that was probably one of the harder things that we did. Next slide. And here we have just a picture of our sea kayaks up there. As you know, it's cold in Alaska, so we all had dry suits, so we would wear them to paddle over, usually take them off during the day while we're picking up all the stuff. But this particular beach, we got lots of stuff off of this one. This one's directly exposed to the Pacific, particularly calm day, and that took us about almost a week to get all the junk off that. And in the distance towards the those trees, you could see some of those Tyvek bags, which are fairly heavy to move around. But you know, even though we're picking up garbage, it was beautiful. I mean, just what an opportunity to be paddling around Alaska. That was pretty amazing. Next slide, please. Here's a pile of nets. We just cutting those apart and then putting them in the bags. We all had our big Grundon's rain gear, because it just rained constantly, and Gore-Tex was never going to be up to the job. So just put on your rubber rain suit and try to stay dry. Next slide, please. This is a friend of mine, Dawn, who's holding it's a fly swatter, and I think it's like a football team logo. And we found so many of those things. I think some Walmart truck had fallen off, and a Walmart cargo thing had fallen off the ship. We found so many of these logoed fly swatters. They're probably headed off, you know, from China to Walmart. It's just amazing how much crap that we buy and have shipped around. It's junk. Next slide. This person here, Steve, and he worked he was an assistant to the, he helped out at that little hut that I showed you earlier on, and he had a Zodiac there, so he would go around, and some of the smaller bags he would pick up and then bring back to the little state park place that we used. Next slide, please.
Whitney, what was the temperature while you were there?
It was fairly warm for Alaska, so it was probably about high 50s. You know, once in a while you might wear like when we were back at the little hut, we might wear shorts, but it got pretty, last summer was particularly warm and calm. We were there in early June, and that tends to be fairly calm. The bad weather hasn't really started yet. Mm-hmm. But the water's always cold. If you're going to paddle, you really want to be in a dry suit. Mm-hmm. Maybe a wetsuit. So this is picture here is towards the end of our stay there, so you could see all those bags. So each one of those bags is probably 100 or some odd, couple hundred pounds in there, particularly if they have the nets. So that was a lot of stuff that we gotten on. And then by the end of the summer, when all the groups, I saw pictures from the end, and they just had, that whole place was full of those bags. And this island of Shuyak, one of the things that was interesting, we all spent a couple days hosted by volunteers in Kodiak before we went out to Shuyak. And people in Kodiak love this island. They really care for it. And we got treated so well because they were so happy that we were going out to, you know, help clean this place up. And in fact, some of the local people in Shuyak, they towed the boats out. They towed all those kayaks. We had very nice kayaks out there, and they weren't out there normally. So there's a lot of local buy-in for that, which is something nice. You know, it's nice not to have just a bunch of outsiders coming in and doing things. So next slide. So this is when we're taking off, and the next group is coming in, and we're actually fairly lucky. We were able to leave. That particular day, the weather was sort of turning, and so we watched that float plane come, sort of circle around again and leave, and then had to go back and try again a couple hours later. So we had a fabulous ride out there, but this other group, they didn't have quite as pleasant a ride coming out. So next slide, please. So this gets us back to the Florida Keys, and on the left-hand side is that plastic that was wrapped around our motor and could have been a dangerous situation. And on the right, for those of you who have anything to do with Paddle Florida, that is a Paddle Florida t-shirt. And our sailboat at the time is parked in the Bay Honda Marina. And so that's just sort of bringing us back to what got me thinking about my my year of plastics. And I don't have a great conclusion other than I think there's a lot of people working on plastics. And I think for those of you who either are assessors or especially those of you who are volunteers at volunteers or guides, for example, taking people out, I think it's important to get people to think about the issues of plastic. And I know it can be a difficult thing, especially if you're working with paying customers. You don't want to browbeat people, but it is an opportunity. You can get a teachable moment when people show up with plastic water bottles. I know Paddle Florida gives out a water bottle, so people don't have to use that. But we've just got we're having so many problems with water bottles and those plastic curd cups. And if you can get people to maybe take some of this home and think about it, then that would be a real service. And I know obviously I'm preaching to the converted here, but it's something to think about anyway. And so I ended up being about 10 minutes shorter than I thought, because I'm used to talking with, having a dialogue and not just talking. So I'm a little bit early, but I'd be happy to take questions or response or whatever.
So I was just going to interject, it's Nancy McPhee, that the town of Fort Myers Beach actually had their first workshop on Monday to ban straws in restaurants on the beach here in Lee County, and I thought that was pretty progressive of a somewhat normally slow to the action council. So we were pleased to hear that. I'm sure that's happening in a lot of communities.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because straws are a huge issue. Right now I'm up in Tybee Island, Georgia, and they had a huge issue here. They're trying to get them to ban plastic bags because the turtles eat them. And people here, they love turtles. People in Tybee love the turtles, but it became a huge issue and they weren't able, the local grocery store pretty much shut it down. I think they'll try again, but that's great if you got Fort Myers to do that. That's fabulous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is Janice. When you think about plastic and you think about plastic around the world and how all our water bodies are being affected, not only by what we're doing, but what's being done elsewhere, it really brings home the point that little things matter, right?
Yeah.
This was great to look at the two different areas that you had visited, Whitney. I was recently in Tennessee, and I was looking at a study of all the rivers around the world and all the issues, and then they talked about various animals that were being affected and are now, on the extinct list because of, things in their environment which are, could be caused elsewhere. So little things matter, I guess, is the message.
And that's a great point, Janice, about the little things matter, because that is something every individual can do and say, I'm going to reduce plastics, I'm going to go pick them up. And it is something where an individual person can have some effect. And I think a lot of things like climate change require they require maybe a larger social effort or political effort. And I think a lot of us feel hopeless, kind of helpless sometimes. But plastics, it is something you can actually make a change. So I think it can empower people as well.
Yes, which would be great.
Yeah, can y'all hear us?
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I hear you.
We have a pretty weak signal, so not. Yeah, I was going to suggest too. I mean, we have to start with small steps. You go into the council to ban straws, but also working with restaurants and food trucks and vendors to eliminate styrofoam would be an excellent next step.
Yeah.
That has a huge impact on the environment. I know you see a lot of that when you're doing a cleanup. So I think Paddle Florida, I believe you're getting people to bring utensils on your trips. Is that right, Janice?
That is correct.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a really good thing to promote and get people thinking about a throwaway lifestyle. So I'm really encouraged by that.
Yeah, and it's not that hard. One of the college I went to, Bowdoin, the students buy these little plastic containers, and so if they want to get takeout, they put their stuff in that container and take it home. And once enough people do it, it's not seen as weird, it's normal.
Right.
So kind of, as far as the social science of when am I going to, how do you make something a habit, or how do you make it socially acceptable? When your peers do it, then it's normal and not weird.
Sure.
Exactly.
I know there's a little restaurant near me I go to a good bit, and they charge you 50 cents extra if you don't bring your own containers for takeout.
Oh, that's
A little
good.
incentive.
This is Lynn. I had a question about the Alaska cleanup. I was wondering, once it's cleaned up and nice like you left it, how long would it take before you would have to do that again? Would it be, a year, or would it get nasty quickly, or was there any estimates on that?
That's a good question. I know that people are doing studies on how long all these things take, and part of Tom's program was doing research on that, like, where did these things come from and how long do they take to get there. Some of the lighter things might float over, like water bottles, which are things that float sort of in that second substrate of water, like 4 or 5 feet down. That might come fairly soon. Some of those things, like the nets, that had been there for a long time. I mean, some of those things were really buried. So that's a really good question. I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but it probably, some of it, different weights of things are going to take different amounts of time. But I think at least a couple of years.
Oh, that's
maybe
good.
more than that. So it's not, yeah, because that'd be really depressing to go back next year and find like,
right. Right.
We just.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Whitney, was there any feedback from the particles that you had collected on the expedition? And I think that they were, looking to examine the effect on, the environment, people's bodies, so on and so forth.
No, that's a good question. I don't have it yet. I don't think everything has come out yet and been published. And so there's some smaller studies, and I know people are working on that, but they haven't. I don't think it's been out in journals. And there was some problems with some studies about fish eating small plastics, and there were some people accused. There was research on that out of Sweden, and I don't think it's related to the expedition, but there were people who accused them of poor science, and so I don't know, your shoddy methodology, basically. So there has been a little kerfuffle about that particular bit of research, but it's not out enough to be published, basically. I mean, this stuff takes so long to get out. As a person who publishes, it's painful and it's horrible how long it takes.
Yeah.
And I'm keeping an eye on it. I would like to, I would put that out there. Like, I'd like to share that once I hear it.
Yes. And then my other question was just, you're working with people from all over the world. Sorry to interrupt you, Beth. And, is there,
That's okay.
what does, what are the thoughts of people, that you heard, regarding what's going on and, in our water bodies and what they see? I mean, are they equally as horrified as we are?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that obviously the group that went on me with, you're talking about a sample of people who actually sign up and do something like that. So, I mean, again, it's preaching to the converted, but I think they are pretty horrified. And I think most of the people on this trip were from Europe or the UK. There was 2 of us from the US and 1 Canadian, but most everyone else was from somewhere in the European Union. And over there, it seems like they're more worried. We've got more political issues about environmental issues in the US than they do over. I mean, they've got some, but I think Europe is pretty concerned about some of these things. Overall, Europe has been more willing to address issues about food and various things than the US has. So I think they're pretty horrified by all of this and concerned.
Well, good. Lots of people taking action. That's what we need.
Yeah, and it's good to see people, and I was really happy to see people in the, talk to people who are concerned about it, who are from the from Barbados and St. Lucia, because very often environmentalism has been considered sort of the, a rich person's or a full belly phenomenon, and that's not necessarily true. I've done work in India and different places, that a lot of people whose economies are tied specifically to having a decent environment, or poor people tend to bear the brunt of environmental degradation. So they, a lot of people who even are not necessarily first world, they're also very concerned for a variety of reasons as well.
Yeah.
Whitney, this is Beth.
Hi, Beth.
We're fading in and out, but
Okay.
I was going to ask this, and then Liz asked me too while we were on mute. Remember the young girl who devised some kind of contraption that goes through these ocean gyres and cleans them up?
Mm-hmm.
How is that? I thought it was doing a good job, like it had positive results.
I think it is. I'm not really. I haven't really followed that. I think it is having, from what I vaguely remember, it is having good results. I just think it's, some of these things are so big.
Yeah.
And even if, and I'm glad we're cleaning them up, but remember, we're also because say Keurig cups have gotten so popular lately, things like that. I mean, we're generating so much crap that just goes out there. So even if we clean, those things have been out there for who knows how long, but our rate of generating things is going up a lot as well, and particularly as countries like, say, India, for example, as they modernize and they have more of a middle class. I mean, they are trying to confront their plastic bag issue. It's a huge issue there, but still they generate a lot. As they buy more things, they're sending more stuff out into the oceans as well. So it's going up. The amount of stuff that's getting out into the oceans is still going up. So we have some challenges.
Is there any other questions for Whitney?
Whitney, this is Bruce. Thank you. This is a great presentation, great reminder. I really like your pictures. I think that sometimes you can educate and convince folks in a lot of different ways, but something about pictures that become especially powerful, and seeing that those plastic collections in those unbelievably scenic places are really, really powerful to folks who maybe just haven't stopped and thought about it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
A couple of questions that come to mind as I listen to you talk. One was, I'd heard in the past that when you're talking about microplastics, that you don't see a lot of red microplastics because those tend to be eaten more by animals.
Mm-hmm.
With your hands-on experience, does that hold true to what you've seen? Is that just a nice story? What's your reflection on that?
That's a good question. I can't give you a great answer. I don't remember seeing as much of the red plastic, and I have read some of the same things about the reds being attracted to marine life. I've heard that same. I've heard that. I don't think it's just a story, but I just started reading about some people calling into question about how to what extent are animals eating some of these materials. I mean, we know turtles do, for example, but so I think some of that. I mean, I just started reading about some of this research being called into question, so I started looking more into that, but I haven't done that much more on that. But that's a question.
Again, I've seen similar to what you've seen. Whereas, I mean, it's anecdotally, it's a very interesting, and it sells well. But I have yet to see anything substantive to back that up. Another question comes to mind again, as I mentioned earlier, as a social scientist. I'm curious. Have you done anything? You mentioned your background in ethnography. Have you done anything in autoethnography related to some of these trips?
No, I haven't done that. I thought about it, and I was working on another project at the same time I did that. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to do, though. But I didn't do it.
Well, you still have. I mean, I'm sure you have your extensive notes, whatnot. Have you done that? Do you have any experience in that space?
I haven't done autoethnography, not that
Okay.
same.
The
But I'd be interested in learning. I've read. I've not done it in that way, but I'd be interested in talking with you more, maybe another time about that.
Right, exactly. I was just going to say my email is something that I'm sure you can get from Nancy. Other places, I'd be glad to connect with you. Either talk to me directly or to put you in contact with other folks who are also folks in that field. As you mentioned, it was surprising to see the South Carolina Gamecock logo show up in Alaska.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw some really interesting things, like how the heck does this get up there?
Yeah.
You know,
Definitely on the wrong coast. Also semi-related, as you've studied plastics, I know this kind of goes beyond what you specifically shared, but have you seen any, or have you looked into anything about recycling non-virgin plastics into anything like filament for 3D printers or for other reuse options? Obviously, if we can avoid it, then that's better, but have you looked at any or come in contact with any other folks that are doing that? And I'm thinking particularly in from the trash heaps, not necessarily so much from the gyres.
No, I have not talked to anyone about that. You know, that sort of goes out of my sphere in a sense. I mean, it makes sense, and I'm sure there's people in the sciences looking at that. You know, at various research universities, but I haven't actually done anything like that, or really followed up on that either. But that's you know, is something that really makes sense.
Especially with the folks who are already working as pickers on those a lot of those trash heaps, it can, if they were able to turn it into a low-grade filament, then they could potentially be producing a value-added item for something that's not a whole lot of money. And again, that's not anything I've been able to actually do a social science study on, but it's something that I've found interesting, and I think that would be a possibility to be an interesting study, but then also an interesting outreach. But I was just curious if you'd done anything with that.
No, I think that'd be a great thing, because especially in some of those, whether it's the Caribbean or places like India, that would be employment. I mean, that would be, you know, it could really help people a lot.
Right.
So, makes sense.
Exactly, it crosses into both of those places. But again, great stuff. Thank you. Nancy, do you have the capability to pass my information along to Whitney?
I do, and you can also see her in her bio, I believe. There may be, but I definitely will do that, Bruce, for sure.
Okay.
Bruce, thank you for suggesting that, because I just finished another major project. I mean, just like a couple months ago, and so now I can kind of start thinking a little more about this as so.
That's fine.
Perfect time.
I'm not trying to steal the show or push you in any other space. I am getting toward the end of co-editing a book on autoethnography right now, so it's a space that I'm familiar with.
I wish could have that book for when I'm teaching our fieldwork class.
Well, it'll be, we're putting it out open source, so it'll be something that you're able to use if you choose.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely be in touch.
Great. Thanks, Whitney.
Okay.
Any other questions for Whitney?
I have a question. I guess it's a two-part question. First, to bring it more local, are there places in Florida that are more susceptible to a disproportionate amount of trash from either wind, currents, tides? And secondarily, is there an opportunity to create some kind of local attention to those hotspots that we may or may not have?
You know, those are good questions. Honestly, I don't know. But that would make, I'm sure someone has to have done a database on that or looked at that to see where, you know, just in terms of flows. You know, I know the Georgia coast gets a lot of things, but that's a really, I honestly just don't know. And those are great questions. Because that would make sense. I'm trying to think of who would have that kind of information. I'm sure people who do flows. You know, maybe that's something I can look into and ask.
Yeah, I'm curious because when we're out doing tours and stuff, it's always great to bring in these global issues like plastics in the North Pacific Gyre and things like that, but to be able to bring it home to, have you ever been to wherever? Or maybe even do some Florida paddle trips or other trips to these particular hotspots and do a lot of publicity around it to bring more attention to it.
I would think any place, even some of those places where you get like that Driftwood Beach off of Jacksonville, where you just get a lot of stuff piling up. I would think anywhere where you're going to get a lot of, wood piled up, for example, especially on the Atlantic coast, then you'd have stuff there. I mean, that's what it looked like when we were in Alaska. It was where those wood piles were, because everything would just get washed up with the tide or storms or something. And so, I mean, just intuitively, it would make sense that that's where those things would be. Now, where the larger flows are in Florida, I'm not really sure about. But I would think on the West Coast, particularly the Southwest with all those islands, I would think things get caught up in there. But I mean, someone else might have a better, idea on that. I don't know, Beth, seeing things in Naples or something. There's just so much shoreline on some of those islands. But that's a great question. And that would, you're right, to keep it local, and for people who are doing tours or for various, Paddle Florida events, to be able to point people towards real hotspots would be a real asset.
Yeah, when we go out with U.S. Fish, we pick up in the 10,000 islands. There's a lot of fishing stuff out there.
Yeah, this is Janice. I'm making a note about that, Whitney, that, to identify hot spots throughout the state of Florida and, find a way that we could share that information to our Florida Sea members. That would be good information to have.
Yeah, I can contact someone. Janice, maybe write this down, because I'll probably forget once I say this, but the UF has the Water Institute, and there's got to be someone in that institute who studies this kind of thing, and that'd be pretty easy to email them and see what resources there are on that.
Yeah, because I'm in agreement. That's a good idea. We all know about the Swanee cleanup and the springs, but maybe not so much about specific areas that are affected, by the flows.
It would be nice to be able to get people other than the usual cast of characters that show up for our cleanups.
Yeah.
And maybe some kind of outreach with a school or some other way to generate additional publicity around the issue.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Wayne, one of the things is you have to think about is, are you trying to, depending on your group that you're going with, are you trying to reach it from land? Because a lot of times the stuff also collects in the emergent growth that of whatever type in the littoral zones or the mangroves or any of those spaces where kayaking actually becomes an optimal way to get it. So you kind of have to depend on think about whether you're trying to approach it from land or you have the ability to come at it with kayaks. But again, anytime places where stuff like driftwood, which is the heavier stuff, is going to wash up. But then also you think about any of the islands and think about any place where that stuff is going to get caught on, which any of that emergent growth, particularly around the edges, is also a big place where that stuff gets caught. So again, I'm sure the research will give you a lot more details of what you're looking for, but that's something just from an anecdotal perspective that I've seen.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions or comments? Well, I just want to thank Whitney for your time. I bet you're in somewhere beautiful and you had to plug into technology tonight. We appreciate your time, and your presentation was great. I want to just remind
you guys for being there. It was great to hear. You guys had great questions. This is really helping me think about this, so I really appreciate your good questions.
So we will, as I said, post the webinar eventually, when I figure out how, onto the Florida Sea YouTube page, and I will promote that socially from Florida Sea when that happens, so members can continue to access the webinar. I did want to remind you that next month we will have another webinar. This is our ongoing effort to continue educating our members as well as our pending certified operators. It will be on September 20th, and the topic is climate change. So we hope that you'll all tune in. The registration link is not live for that yet, but I will be sure those of you on the call tonight get access to register when it is. So thank you all, and have a great night.
Okay, we appreciate it. Thank you. All right, bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Nancy.
You're welcome. Thank you, Lynn, for the comment.